The morning fog hugged the Oregon coast like a secret. To the fishermen who left harbor before sunrise that day in September 1942, it felt like any other routine trip. The world was at war, yes, but out here, the Pacific still seemed too wide, too calm, too empty. Then they smelled it. A stinging scent of burnt oil drifting across the waves. Not the usual tang of diesel, something sharper, metallic, foreign. One boat slowed, nets half-cast, as black streaks began to glide past the hull. At first they thought it was wreckage, maybe a tanker gone down hundreds of miles offshore. But as the mist lifted, they saw twisted plates of metal still steaming, a slick rainbow of oil spreading wider by the minute. When they radioed the Coast Guard, no ship was reported missing. The ocean had coughed up a mystery. Only a handful of men in distant Navy offices guessed what that debris might mean. Because beneath that same stretch of ocean silent, invisible, something was moving. Long, narrow riveted steel crawling just below the surface. A predator. Inside its hull, 40 men listened to the faint buzz of instruments, breathing recycled air that smelled of metal and fear. Their commander, Lieutenant Meiji Tagami, stood over the chart table, tracing a line toward a place no Japanese warship had ever dared approach America's mainland. Above them, the Pacific rolled as if nothing stirred beneath. The gulls cried. The fishermen pulled in their nets. The continent behind them slept peacefully. No one could imagine that within mere hours, that sleeping coast would become the target of an attack unlike any in U.S. history, an assault so small, so secret, that almost nobody would ever know it happened. Through all the thunder of World War II, through the arsenals, the fleets, the bombers screaming over cities, this story slipped quietly through the cracks. Yet it's the only time the war truly touched the American mainland. And it began right here, in this fog, on this morning, with a smell of burnt oil and a question that no one could answer. How a Japanese submarine reached the U.S. mainland and nobody knew. When Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, it didn't just sink ships, it sank the illusion that distance was safety. Overnight, America's Pacific coast stiffened in fear. Children practiced hiding under desks. Families taped their windows. Soldiers built gun emplacements on beaches that had once been playgrounds. If the enemy could reach Hawaii, how far could they reach next? Across that same ocean, Japan's Imperial Navy asked the same question, but in reverse. How far could they send their reach east? The answer would rest on a machine conceived in secrecy, a submarine unlike any the world had ever seen. In massive sheds at Yokosuka, engineers sketched designs that read like science fiction. They called them I-class submarines, giants that could carry their own airplane locked inside a watertight hangar. On surfacing, hydraulics would slide open steel doors. A compressed air catapult would hurl the aircraft skyward, and within minutes a pilot could scout or strike targets hundreds of miles away. Brilliant, dangerous, and completely untested. To command one of these experimental leviathans, the Navy chose a quiet strategist, Lieutenant Commander Meiji Tagami. He had earned a reputation for calm under pressure and an almost unnatural patience. His vessel, Submarine I. Inside her narrow steel ribs, 40 men prepared for the strangest mission any had heard. Cross the Pacific, surface near America's west coast, and launch a seaplane to ignite fires across Oregon's dense forests. The concept seems absurd now, bombing pine trees to frighten a superpower, but Japan's idea was psychological warfare, not destruction, but dread. If American cities choked on wildfire smoke, morale would crumble. Every radio headline would whisper, "The enemy is here." And so, in the late summer of 1942, fuel drums were loaded, charts sealed in waterproof tubes, and a single Yokosuka E-14Y Glenn seaplane was folded into the submarine's belly. 2 small thermite bombs, each lighter than a sack of rice, would become their entire arsenal. As I-25 slipped from her harbor under starlight, no farewell salutes echoed, no bands played. Her periscope cut through black water like a needle through silk, then vanished. The sailors inside whispered a prayer to the sea gods and to the darkness that would shield them all the way to America. They were chasing something unseen. Not victory, not even destruction, but the idea of fear itself. And the Pacific, wide and ancient, opened before them like a dare. After 3 weeks at sea, I-25 had crossed the Pacific unseen. On September 9th, 1942, beneath a gray sky and rolling fog, she surfaced 60 miles from Oregon's rocky shore. The war had just arrived at America's doorstep, quietly, on the breath of the tide. Inside, Captain Tagami's voice came through the tunnel of metal. "Prepare the aircraft." Crewmen stripped away bolts, swinging open the hangar like the petals of a mechanical flower. Condensation poured off its hinges. Within it waited the folded Yokosuka E-14Y Glen, barely 30 feet long, yet holding the hopes of an empire. Mechanics wiped her wings, latched 2 small bombs beneath them, and fueled her tank until fumes stung their eyes. The pilot, Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita, stepped forward. Around his neck, a child's lucky charm, a small silk flag signed by friends and family to protect him. He bowed briefly toward the rising sun painted on the sub's tower, then climbed into the cockpit beside his observer, Shoji Okuda. "Engines ready. Wind steady." Tagami raised his hand one sharp gesture and vanished below deck. The catapult thundered. The seaplane shot off the bow in a spray of white mist, carving through the fog like a bullet through glass. Seconds later, the submarine dove again, submerging to hide before American eyes could find them. For the next 40 minutes, Fujita flew alone over a world that couldn't imagine he existed. Below him stretched endless forest, ridges of green broken only by rivers curling toward the Pacific. His compass pointed east. The morning sun rose behind him. At 30 miles inland, he reached the target-thick timber near Mount Emily. He checked altitude, shouted to Okuda through engine roar, and pulled the release lever. 2 bombs plunged into the trees. A heartbeat later came dull orange bursts. Columns of smoke coiled upward, twisting in the wind. From his cockpit, Fujita saw the flicker of flames spread across the pines, the black seam of smoke smearing the dawn. Mission complete. The flight back was a race against fuel and weather. Clouds gathered. Drizzle streaked his goggles. When the Pacific finally glimmered through the fog again, he and Okuda spotted a small dark shape waiting below I-25, surfaced like a shadow at the coordinates they'd memorized. Within minutes, the crew seized ropes, dragged the wet seaplane aboard, folded its wings, and sealed it away. They were soaked, trembling, exhausted, but alive. The men crowded the narrow corridors, silent except for low murmurs of disbelief. They had just bombed America. Neither they nor their superiors knew the fires would fizzle quickly, smothered by rain and the vigilance of Oregon's forest rangers. But in that moment, beneath 50 feet of dark water, 40 men believed they had shifted the war's horizon. For the first and only time, an enemy aircraft had struck the continental United States. I-25 turned west and disappeared into the deep, leaving only smoke drifting above the trees and silence behind it. The morning after the bombing, smoke still draped the ridges east of Brookings, Oregon. Rangers Howard Guard and Keith Johnson of the Forest Service spotted the plume while on patrol. They assumed the cause was natural lightning, perhaps, or an unattended campfire. The Pacific Northwest burned easily in late summer. But when they reached the site, the scene looked wrong. 2 craters smoldered amid shattered pines. The air reeked of burned metal. They found odd shards, gray powder unlike anything from their usual fires. Hours later, those fragments and traces of thermite would be carried to Army intelligence officers in Portland, sparks of evidence hinting at something unbelievable. Within a day, word reached Washington. Commanders knew the truth. An enemy aircraft had bombed the United States. It hadn't destroyed a city or killed anyone, but symbolically it had pierced national pride more deeply than they dared admit. The War Department made its decision in minutes' silence. There would be no press release, no radio alert, no mention that a Japanese submarine had breached the homeland's defenses. The reasoning was simple and brutal. Panic was more dangerous than damage. So the reports were stamped secret. Newspapers received polite phone calls advising restraint. Headlines that might have screamed "Enemy bombs Oregon" shrunk into single-sentence blurbs about a small forest blaze quickly contained. The public went back to work. Children caught frogs in the rivers, unaware that just miles away, a new page of wartime history had burned itself into the soil. 2 weeks later, I-25 reappeared near Port Orford to make a second try. Again, Fujita flew. Again, bombs fell. Again, rain smothered the flames before they could spread. When he landed, Allied patrol aircraft were already on their trail. Depth charges churned the water into white fury, detonations shaking the hull so hard the light bulbs shattered. Through skill or raw luck, Tagami escaped, diving beneath a cold thermal layer that hid the submarine from American sonar. Limping, dented, they fled across the Pacific and returned home heroes the world never knew existed. Then came silence. For 20 years, the story sat buried in naval archives, gathering dust. Generations grew up never hearing a word of it, until one strange invitation changed everything. In 1962, the residents of Brookings, by then a quiet timber town, wrote to the man who'd bombed them. They asked him to visit, not as an enemy, but as a friend. Nobuo Fujita hesitated each night, replaying the question in his mind. Would they welcome him or condemn him? Finally, he accepted. When he stepped onto American soil that summer, he carried no weapon, only his family's samurai sword, more than 400 years old. Standing before the townspeople, he bowed deeply and offered it as a gesture of peace. A hush filled the hall. Then applause. The pilot, who had once come to burn their home, was now honored as a guest. Over the years that followed, Fujita sponsored scholarships for local children and returned several times, each visit quieter and more heartfelt than the last. When he died in 1997, his ashes were scattered above the forest he'd once set aflame. The people of Brookings called him friend. Today, a small wooden sign marks the lookout site where the fire began. Moss creeps across its edges. Most travelers pass without noticing, but stand there long enough, and you can still hear the wind threading through the pines. War turned whisper, hostility transformed into memory. The attack caused almost no damage. Its echo, however, reminds us that even in the vast geography of war, humanity can surface in the strangest places. A fisherman's rumor, a hidden submarine, a pilot's bow decades later. And somewhere beneath the Pacific, iron rests on the ocean floor, the remains of E-25, his story finally rising to the surface.